Hello and welcome back, friends. The other week for my birthday, I went to see the live action remake of How to Train Your Dragon. I was skeptical going in because we've all seen how these live action remakes can really up a beloved classic. But with How to Train Your Dragon, I'm pleased to say that is not the case. I think part and parcel of that is because Dean DeBlois co-directed the original and directed the live action, so there wasn't a director ego in the way trying to make something their own. What I like about the film is it doesn't try to create a realistic world live adaptation, which changes the look of the original, but instead they embrace the idea of animation. This can be seen in the overall arcing design from the costumes, the sets, and the props. And it's clear that they looked at the characters and thought, what would this character look like if they could step out of the screen and enter our world? What live action allowed the filmmakers to do is expand the characters, their backstory, their interests, as well as the setting and the design without affecting the plot or the feel of the original loved story. So Disney, take notes because this is how you make a live action rendition of a beloved classic. So this week I'm going to make Hiccup's axe. We get to see Hiccup wield it in the original and in the new live action. It's completely made out of EVA foam and uses a PVC pipe as its support, and that's it. So let's get started. Okay, we want to start with a 42-inch piece of 3/4 inch PVC. Now, the axe handle has some curves in it, so I need to warp the pipe, and to do that, I have my template of the axe and I place the pipe directly on the image. At the spots where it needs to bend, I heat the pipe with a heat gun, and I'm rolling the pipe back and forth so it heats evenly and not just on one side. Once the pipe is soft, I bend it to match the image and hold it in place until it cools down and the pipe stiffens back up. I do this for the length of the handle until I'm left with a pipe matching the drawing. Now to start building up the axe. I begin with part A, and I'm rolling the foam a little to help it take on the curve that I need. It'll just help it wrap around the pipe a little easier. Then I add a bead of super glue to one of the long ends like so, and attach this onto the straight end of the pipe. I'm using super glue to only hold this edge in place. It'll help keep the piece straight on the pipe for the next step. Then I apply a layer of contact cement to both the foam and the pipe. Make sure both are completely covered because you want good adhesion the whole way around. Instead of waiting for the glue to air dry, I speed up the process a little by hitting the contact cement with a heat gun. I don't try to dry it out completely, only to the point where the wet shine disappears. If it's too wet, it won't adhere properly, and if it's too dry, it won't either. It needs that sweet spot, and that is right at the point when the contact cement loses the wet look. Then the foam can be firmly wrapped around the pipe. Now the seam needs to be sanded down some. I'm not too concerned with making it really clean because it's going to get covered, but I want to knock it down a little bit so the foam looks even all the way around the pipe. Now it's up to you how you attach your foam, but I've attached mine so the seam will be partially covered up by the blade pieces later on. The 10mm isn't thick enough, so I add on part B by using the previous process. I align the seam right on top of the other and wrap it around, rubbing as I go to make sure that it is attached without any air bubbles between the foam. And even off the seam a little bit with a medium grit sanding drum on my Dremel. Next, I switch the Dremel to a finer grit, like a 200, and round over the top edge slightly. Then I carve a groove into the bottom of part B about 1/2 inch up from the edge. I've marked the 1/2 inch with a ballpoint so I have a reference line to work off of. Notice, I have the Dremel set at an angle so just the edge of the drum is touching the foam. This is an easy way to create a small groove that you can then expand with more passes if you want to. Before continuing with the axe head, I'm going to build up the wood texture on the rest of the pipe. Instead of wrapping it and having to carve texture, I'm gluing 10mm foam strips onto the pipe. Don't attach in straight lines, add some slight curves and waviness into the pieces, and keep adding until all the pipe is completely covered. So this is what mine looks like, and trust me, like when it's finished it will look like wood, but first I want to just hit the edges of the strips so they aren't so angular. Okay, so now it looks like this, and next I'm adding on some EVA foam clay. I'm using this to fill in the gaps between the strips and smearing it over the strips as well. To really even the foam, you can dip your fingers in some water and smooth and blend it. This will help even out the surface and blend the sections of clay into each other as well as the strips. And this is how mine is looking. The clay is still wet, but you can see how it has a linear wood texture to it. This is created by using the strips underneath and by blending the foam lengthwise on those strips. Now I'm going to let that dry overnight before I handle it again. In the meantime, I'm going to work on part C. I found it easy to trace the design onto one piece and glue several pieces in a pile. That way I can cut out the entire head at once and reduce the edge cleanup later on. And side note, I initially started with 4 sheets, but later on decided that it was too thick, so I reduced it down to 3 layers of 10mm foam. Okay, with the head cut, it's time to bevel the blade edge. I first draw the shape of the bevel onto the top edge. You can see how it tapers to the center point of the center piece of foam, and I drew a line down the center, and on the bottom have the bevel line up like it should. And to cut the bevel, I'm using a meat carving knife. You could Dremel it all off, but that will take forever and it creates a huge mess. So I like to cut away as much excess as possible with the carving knife, and by using my reference lines, I can slice through the foam easily. I can't take credit for this. I saw it being done in a TikTok video before, but I've never been able to find it again. But I fell in love with the technique because it's fast and efficient. While I continue carving, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize your notifications so you never miss a project. Thank you. Alright, so the bevel was cut, and I'm just going to take the Dremel now and even off the lines that were left behind by the carving knife a little bit. I'm not worried about getting it really clean because it'll be covered up later on. This will just help to even everything up so nothing telegraphs through. Now, when using layers of foam like this and then beveling, you might notice some lines like this showing. But again, in this case, it's nothing to worry about. Next up is part D, and since these pieces are thin and flimsy, I found that starting with aligning the short straight edge, and then the top straight edge, and then the bottom edge curve helps to keep the curve that ends up against the bevel in line with its edge. Make sure the pieces are firmly attached without any air bubbles. I switched the tip on the Dremel to the sanding stone, and I lightly round over the edges of part D. This is sanding a little, but mainly it's heating up the foam and pressing it into the curved shape, sort of like what you do to leather with the burnishing tool. Next up is a part E on each side as well. I've already burnished the edges with the sanding stone, and I'm just pressing it into place. Previously, I also did a test fit and drew some reference lines so I can get the piece to sit in its exact spot once the glue was put in place. Now, this needs to look like a Celtic knot intertwining with itself, so I switch back to a sanding drum, and using my pattern as a reference, I sand some edges to create some grooves. I'm trying not to go too deep, just enough so it'll be visible, and then bevel it off on one side so it looks like some go under others. Part F gets cut so there's about 1/4 of an inch extra on the larger curved edge. These pieces are glued onto the bevel like this, nice and tight up against part D. And we want part F to stick slightly above part D, that's why these extra pieces are being added onto the bevel. Now, that 1/4 inch extra is so the two pieces overlap slightly. That way the seam can be sanded to create a nice clean edge like this, and this look is authentic of a real axe blade, cause this edge would be where the sharpening happens. I thought I filmed it, but somehow I missed it. On the vertical straight edge of the blade, I carved out a channel so the blade can sit snugly against the center shaft. At this point, the clay has sat and dried overnight, and using contact cement, I can firmly attach the blade onto the shaft about 1 inch down from the top edge of the shaft. I make sure there's plenty of glue, and I'm making sure to really press the blade onto the shaft to guarantee all the surface in the channel is securely touching. Part G is treated the same way as the blade, the curved edge carved to a bevel, but here G is carved slightly, like 1/4 of an inch, to create a slight inset. The vertical edge gets a channel carved out, and the part G gets attached to the shaft just like the blade. Part H gets carved and is used to create a plug to cover the opening at the top of the shaft. Part I consists of 12 rivets. Each is cut from 10mm foam and beveled to create a rounded top. Each side gets 6, and use the pattern for easy placement, that way you don't have to deal with measurements. Okay, at this point the build is finished and I'm just going to add some textures. I put one of these small ball sanders into my Dremel, and I'm going to use this to add some texture around the knotwork. Holding the stylus vertical, I'm repeatedly lifting and lowering the ball onto the surface. This will stipple the surface of the foam, creating a nice hammered texture. Now, the reason I'm doing this after I attach the knotwork is because I wanted the part E's to sit flat on the surface. If I had added the texture first, it would have created an uneven surface and part E wouldn't sit as nice. Okay, this next step is a double effect. I'm heat sealing the foam to prep it to receive primer and paint, and while the foam is still warm, I'm randomly pressing a crumpled up piece of aluminum foil into the surface. This leaves behind a nice texture resembling some good weathered metal. You just have to watch as you go, because if you heat a textured area again, the texture disappears. Here's mine with the texture. You can see the foam is heat sealed since the black has gotten shiny, and I've tried to keep the texture random enough to look natural. Next, I'm using this quick seal caulk to fill in any gaps between pieces and to cover the seams between the layered pieces. I'm using a plastic paddle knife to press the caulk into the groove, making sure it's completely filled. Then I wet my finger with water and blend the caulk to even it out and smooth away edges. Once the caulk is dry, I mark some areas where I want to add some battle damage, and to create the damage, I'm going to use an angle tip on my wood burner. I'm lightly pressing into the surface of the foam to create nicks and dings. Now, since this is basically melting the foam, and foam is plastic, these fumes are toxic, so wear a mask and work in a ventilated area. It doesn't take long for these areas to cool back down, and I can now prime the foam with Plasti Dip. I'm going to spray on 2 thick layers, and I'm going to let the first sit for 30 minutes before spraying the second. This stuff is great for foam projects because it's a primer layer that receives paint easily and remains flexible, which is great for pieces like this, especially if you want to take it to a con or use it for LARPing. Alright, I let that dry overnight, and I'm going to paint the handle first because I want to paint the wood before adding the leather strapping to it. It'll just make it easier to paint, and I won't have to paint the wood around the leather. I begin by basing the handle with a burnt umber acrylic. Acrylics are great for foam projects because, like the Plasti Dip, they remain flexible after they dry, and you're less likely to have cracking or splitting. Next, I dry brush on some streaks of raw sienna. This will help give some wood grain and highlight the texture we got from the foam clay. Keeping it random with heavy spots and lighter spots helps make the wood look more natural. Now, once that's dry, I give the handle a black wash. This is black acrylic thinned with water. It'll act as a glaze, letting us see the layers of paint underneath and tweaking their hues slightly. It's this technique that will give the paint job more depth and variation, making the final result look more realistic. After that dries, I mix some burnt umber with a tiny bit of flamenco red. Make a wash and brush this on. Initially, yes, it's looking really red, but as it dries, it'll darken. By adding layers of washes like this, it just gives the object more depth so the paint won't look flat. Next, I dry brush on a mixture of raw sienna and burnt umber, keeping it random and sporadic. Notice the redness of the previous step has darkened once it's dried. After that has dried, I want the handle to look like well-worn wood that has been handled by generations, so I'm applying a layer of gloss medium. I thinned the medium with water and brushed it on. It has this milky quality when wet, but dries clear, and I want the final result to look like wood that has been polished with the oils and sweat from the hands of generations of Vikings. When the gloss dries, I glue on a 2mm foam strip. I'm just using super glue and wrapping the strip to create some crisscrossing. And notice the shine on the wood. It's exactly what I wanted, but remember, it was thinned with water, so if you use a gloss medium, it's best to test it on a scrap piece to see how it behaves first. I'm not going to Plasti Dip the strip, but I want to seal the foam slightly, so I'm lightly using the heat gun. Too much can cause the paint to bubble, destroying all the effects, so just be cautious and use the heat gun on low. Then the strips are based with the raw sienna. We're going to be using the same colors as the wood, but by applying them in different orders, it will give a leather looking result. After the sienna dries, I brush on a burnt umber wash, which I dab with a paper towel to remove brush marks, and it also creates a nice dimpling in the paint. Next is the black wash. This is going on heavily, and I'm also letting it go onto the wood between the strapping, and then again dab with the paper towel. where it's hitting the wood around the strap will look like the wood has been stained. Moving on to the axe head, I begin by basing it entirely in a charcoal gray and let that dry. Then I use a metallic tin and a paper towel to pounce the surface. I'm not looking for complete coverage, I still want some of that gray to show through. Once the tin is dry, the entire head receives the black wash and paper towel treatment. This will tone down the metallic shine and make it look more like steel. And once that's dry, we want to pull out some areas with a highlight. For that, I'm using a metallic silver, and I'm primarily catching the knotwork design and the bevel areas on the blade and part G. Also using the silver, I'm lightly touching some of the edges on the nicks and dings. Think of these areas where a sword, claw, or tooth has scratched away the weathered metal to expose some fresh new metal underneath. And like that, Hiccup's axe is finished. This was a fun project to build and really only took me a couple of days, and most of that time was waiting for stuff to dry, but I think the results were worth it. All the different textures, physical and paint on the axe head help accentuate every little aspect of the clean, simple design. You can see how using these layers of paint and washes on the wood create variation and depth in the paint. And even though I used the same colors on the leather, by applying them differently gave a different visual result, allowing the two textures to read separately. As I said, I really enjoyed this build. The axe is oversized and shows how the live action is leaning into the idea of the proportions created in the animated film. It's lightweight, so it's easy to carry around or bang over your friend's head in a campaign. Let me know what you think of the new film and this project. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to make one, as always, the link is in the description. Again, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with all your friends and family, subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at House of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.